We've been learning about the important military events in the Revolutionary War. We've discussed two of the four major events so far, the battles of Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Saratoga. Remember, the battles of Lexington and Concord were the first battles fought in the Revolutionary War, and the Battle of Saratoga was the turning point in the war because of the French alliance that gave us the capability, leadership, resources, and motivation needed in order to win. Today we will talk about Valley Forge and the Battle of Yorktown. Let's start with Valley Forge. France's help after the Battle of Saratoga improved our capability, leadership, and resources for the 13 colonies. But the Continental Army did not immediately get the needed military supplies and money. Remember how long it took Britain to get supplies to its army in the 13 colonies? They had to go all the way across the ocean. Well, the same thing happened with the French. The same distance problem faced France getting supplies and army and navy troops to the colonists. It took them a long time to get here. Valley Forge as a low point. After Saratoga, the Continental Army spent the winter from the end of 1777 to the beginning of 1778 camped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The British Army had captured Philadelphia and spent the winter there. The British Army was able to buy food from the colonial farmers because they had good resources, and were able to stay warm and dry because they lived in the houses in the town of Philadelphia. The conditions that the Continental Army lived under were just the opposite during the very cold winter months. The Continental Army lacked money to buy needed supplies. Even when they could get some money, the Continental Army lacked the horses and wagons needed to bring the supplies to Valley Forge. All winter long, the colonial soldiers had a shortage of food, clothing and blankets, housing, and military supplies. Of 10,000 colonial soldiers, almost 2,500 of them died from disease and cold. Thousands of Continental Army soldiers deserted. Valley Forge was one of the lowest points of morale or motivation faced by the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Again, because the British Army had poor war plans, they did not attack the cold, hungry, and sick Continental Army, although Valley Forge is only 30 miles west of Philadelphia. In spite of all the hardships, the Continental Army kept training under Baron von Steuben all during the war. When spring arrived, the Continental Army was better trained than ever before. Now let's discuss the Battle of Yorktown. This is considered the battle that ended the Revolutionary War. The last event you will read about is the battle that ended the Revolutionary War. That's the Battle of Yorktown, and it took place in 1781. Before you read about the Battle of Yorktown, you need to know what led to the British defeat there. The war in the southern colonies. During the summer in 1778, the British government decided to split the British Army into two parts. Half of the British Army would continue fighting in the New England and Middle colonies, and the other half would attack the southern colonies. The success of the British plan was based on them having a large loyalist population in the South, and they thought that they would join the British Army. At first, the British plan of attacking the Continental Army in the South was very successful. It was a good plan. The British Army, under the command of General Cornwallis, landed at Savannah, Georgia, and they won all of their battles, moving up the coast, right along the water, for Charlestown and Wilmington, North Carolina. The British were successful because they attacked coastal towns next to the water, so they were able to use their navy for support. General Cornwallis and his British Army ran into problems once they got away from the coast and into the more wooded inland areas. The British problem with wilderness fighting hurt General Cornwallis's army. Again, the colonial militia started attacking the British Army from behind trees and rocks and then disappearing into the woods. Using their wilderness fighting tactic, the colonials caused 1/3 of General Cornwallis's troops to become casualties. General Cornwallis makes Southern plantation owners angry. General Cornwallis angered the Southern plantation owners by using Lord Dunmore's idea to offer freedom to enslaved African Americans. He needed more troops and thought this would be the way to get them. He promised the slaves of the colonists that they would be free if they came behind the British lines. In many cases, he kept this promise and then put the former slave men to work. Former slave women were put to work as washerwomen. Slaves of loyalists fleeing to the British, however, were returned to their former masters because they didn't want the loyalists to be upset with them. In a few instances, the British even sold colonial slaves to the Caribbean islands in exchange for supplies or for cash, breaking their promise of freedom. Living conditions for fugitive slaves with the British Army were not very healthy. The British did not protect the escaped African Americans from disease, so thousands of fugitives died of diseases such as yellow fever, dysentery, and pneumonia. Nevertheless, historians estimate that 1/3 of the slaves in Georgia escaped to the British Army, and that many more in the Carolinas and Virginia did too. It's estimated that as many as 25,000 slaves escaped from plantations in Virginia alone. General Cornwallis goes to Yorktown. General Cornwallis found his army in the same predicament as General Burgoyne had been in at Saratoga. Cornwallis was running low on supplies and had many casualties. So to get more troops and supplies, General Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, along the coast. He thought that when he got supplies and troops, he would then move north towards New York, where his army would rejoin British General Clinton's army. What Cornwallis did not know was that he would never make it out of Yorktown, Virginia. Cornwallis's plan was not successful because just north of Yorktown was the huge French navy waiting to cut him off. He also did not know that General Washington and the Continental Army with French reinforcements was nearby as well, fighting at Yorktown. French General Rochambeau persuaded Washington to combine forces and attack Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. British General Clinton tried to save Cornwallis and his troops by sending more ships into Chesapeake Bay, which is shown in the picture with all the boats. But Clinton's plan failed because the French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse's leadership, defeated the British Navy in sea battles in Chesapeake Bay. The British Navy was forced to return to New York without being able to help Cornwallis's troops. General Cornwallis and his British army were tracked. A combined force of approximately 8,000 French soldiers and 9,000 Continental Army soldiers surrounded the British army at Yorktown, and the French Navy prevented any escape by sea. After months of battle, Cornwallis realized that any further fighting would lead to slaughter of his troops. General Cornwallis surrendered in October of 1781. As the British army surrendered, their band played the song, "The World Turned Upside Down." The British after the Battle of Yorktown. It's important to realize General Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown did not mean that the entire British army in the 13 colonies automatically surrendered. He only surrendered the part of the British army that was under his command. But after General Cornwallis's surrender, the remaining British army no longer had any desire or motivation to keep fighting. In March of 1781, 4 months after the Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, the British Parliament voted to end all fighting with the 13 colonies. The British government had had enough and now wanted to make peace and the end to fighting with the colonies.